Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. And today, I'm going to take a look at some of my favorite bands and their most overlooked albums. I did a video recently on 10 rock and metal albums that I thought should have been bigger, and that got me thinking about some of my favorite bands and the albums in their catalogs that get lost in the shuffle for one reason or another, whether it's, just the consequence of a big discography or an album that everybody, including the bands themselves, seem to ignore. So here's 10 in my collection from some of the rock and metal bands I've had in heavy rotation lately. This video is in no particular order, but I figure let's start with my favorite band of all time, Iron Maiden, and I gotta go with Final Frontier here for their most overlooked record, and this is most definitely a situation of just having too many classic albums that the more recent stuff gets overshadowed, but I think Final Frontier absolutely deserves more love than it gets. I also could have gone with A Matter of Life and Death, which happens to be my favorite Iron Maiden album of all time, but I feel like that album has aged exceptionally well in the eyes of the fans, while Final Frontier just gets lost in the post-reunion material. This is the band continuing to expand on their more progressive sound, with standouts on here like El Dorado, the title track, Mother of Mercy, Coming Home, Isle of Avalon, Starblind, The Talisman, When the Wild Wind Blows, The Man Who Would Be King. Great stuff on here. Definitely the band taking influence from Dream Theater, I would say, as they move into their, post-reunion progressive sound that we now know, from Book of Souls and from Senjutsu as well. But, Nico's drumming definitely does feel a bit more nuanced, and the songwriting seems to shift here from a heavier reliance on repetitive choruses compared to albums like Brave New World or Dance of Death. And there's some really great stuff on here, but it's unlikely Maiden will ever play anything live from this record again. I do think it'd be really cool for Maiden to do, kind of a retro tour focusing on the post-reunion albums like they're doing for the classic stuff now with, the Run for Your Lives tour, but who knows how many tours Maiden have left, so I'm not holding my breath for it. Next up, let's go with Alice Cooper and DaDa, released in 1983 to next to no fanfare during Alice's blackout era. This album has the one thing that Special Forces, Zipper Catch a Skin, and Flush the Fashion are all missing, and that is the Bob Ezrin effect. Bob's presence is, instantly noticeable on this album, not just sonically, but creatively as well. And the trio of Alice Cooper, Dick Wagner, and Bob Ezrin pieced together this album while Alice was at his personal and professional rock bottom, and it has all of the elements of a classic Alice Cooper record here. You've got the humor and the witty lyricism on tracks like Dyslexia and No Man's Land. You've got I Love America is a lot of fun as well. Rockers like Scarlet and Sheba, the campy horror of Formerly Warner and Fresh Blood, and of course the phenomenal album closer Pass the Gun Around, which features some of Alice's best lyrics that no one's ever heard, plus my all-time favorite guitar solo from Wagner. And, if there was one song I'd like to hear Alice Cooper play live, ever, it would definitely be Pass the Gun Around. And just let me cook for a second here. How cool would it be to hear Alice, performing Pass the Gun Around in the straitjacket right before they do the guillotine? How cool would that be, right? I mean, it'd just be awesome, but probably never going to happen since Alice says the album scares even him, but I just had to put that into the universe just in case. Next, we have Still Not Black Enough by WASP. In the mid-90s, Blackie Lawless had the impossible task of trying to follow up the Crimson Idol, one of the greatest concept albums in metal history, and he was doing it still without much of a band. WASP was essentially a Blackie solo project by this point, but he kept the band going with this great record, and it barely charted anywhere, but, the band never toured it either. And still, tracks on here that I enjoy, like the title track, their cover of Somebody to Love, Black Forever, Scared to Death, Goodbye America, Keep Holding On, Rock and Roll to Death, Breathe, No Way Out of Here, and I Can't, are just another showcase for Blackie Lawless's growth as a songwriter up to this point. And a lot of these tracks feel like an extension of the Crimson Idol from a lyrical perspective, which, if you guys know how much I love that record, then, more Crimson Idol? Yes, please. How about Queen and Made in Heaven, released in 1995, of course, posthumously after Freddie Mercury's passing here, the band piecing together, solo stuff, some demos, some of Freddie's final recordings as well, to give us one last Queen album. And there was that adage that Freddie had towards the end there of just give me stuff to sing and I'll sing it and you can release it after I'm gone. And this is an album that doesn't get ranked too high in a lot of people's Queen rankings, which I never understood. I really love this record here. Think it's a very worthy follow-up to Innuendo. Love tracks like Made in Heaven, Let Me Live, Mother Love is fantastic, featuring some of Freddie's final vocals, and Brian May comes in and finishes it, so that's a great touch there. My Life Has Been Saved, I Was Born to Love You, Heaven for Everyone, Too Much Love Will Kill You, great ballad there written by Brian May. And so you have, the Freddie Mercury version on this record here, which I think is better than Brian's version from Back to the Light. Also here, You Don't Fool Me, which was pieced together from virtually nothing. And also you have the untitled track here, right? The lengthy closer, which is, been up to a lot of speculation from Queen fans. What is that song about? What is it? It's been regarded by many as Freddie's Trip to Heaven, right? And it's a really ambient track. You know, it's definitely one that I enjoy. Not for casual listening, you know, something that's going to be on a playlist, but when listening to this album, it's a really great track to close things out here. And, you know, we could have gotten nothing, but instead we got this great Queen record here from what they had left over, and so I think that's really cool. And, you know, I enjoy this album a lot. Of course, there's definitely a different kind of energy here, seeing that Freddie Mercury is missing. You know, he was not involved in the album's, you know, the production of the record. You know, Freddie was very hands-on with those things, and so it definitely does feel empty. But I feel like that's also kind of the point of this record, is it does feel empty because Freddie's gone, but we're going to give you what we have left anyway. Coming up next, I'm going to go with UFO and Making Contact. This released here during, you know, a time when UFO were self-destructing. You know, founding member Pete Way had left the band after the Mechanics tour, and there was virtually no bassist here on this record. They had to resort to Paul Chapman playing bass for a majority of this, in addition to lead guitar. And, you know, the Paul Chapman era is very underrated, I would say. You know, he's not Michael Schenker, but he does a fantastic job and had massive shoes to fill, and so I think he did a great job, you know, during his tenure with the band. And this album here is a real hidden gem in their catalog. There's a lot of great deep cuts on here. Even though the band were disarray, I think that they really tried to evolve with the times here and keep up with, you know, some of the other bands in the scene who, you know, may have been influenced by them. Kind of interesting how that works. Now they're competing with those bands, but they held their own here with Blinded by a Lie, Diesel in the Dust, You and Me. When It's Time to Rock is a great song, one of my favorite UFO songs from the Chapman era, just so anthemic and powerful. You have The Way the Wild Wind Blows, Call My Name, All Over You, Push, It's Love, you know, produced by Gary Lyons. Some really good stuff on here, even though it's forgotten in their catalog and was, you know, released during a tumultuous time in their history. That would eventually lead them to disband not too long after, but still, some great stuff on here in my opinion. And, you know, at this time, this was the final UFO album as everything fell apart, but still some great deep cuts on here that I really enjoy, even though the album was produced under a lot of stress. Next, Black Sabbath and Tear from 1990. Black Sabbath tried something a little bit different here lyrically, especially going with more of a Nordic vibe on this album, and love the lineup here, right? Tony Iommi, of course, you have Cozy Powell, Tony Martin, Neil Murray, and Jeff Nichols on keyboards. Really underrated lineup there, and the whole Tony Martin era, I think, has aged really well now, but at the time, Black Sabbath were obviously not at the height of their popularity, to say the least, and so a lot of these albums got, you know, lost in the shuffle, swept by the wayside, but they did some great stuff with Tony Martin, of course, you know, the Headless Cross, Cross Purposes, this album right here, Tear. So some really underrated stuff from the late 80s into the early to mid 90s by Black Sabbath, and I love Tear. It's one of those guilty pleasure Sabbath albums for me. You'll never see it ranked, you know, super high up on anybody's list, but still, tracks like, you know, The Lawmaker, Anna Mundi, Jerusalem, you know, The Sabbath Stones, The Battle of Tear, Odin's Court, Valhalla, Feels Good to Me, Heaven in Black. All these songs flow together really well, and, you know, for me, this is one of the most, you know, cohesive and comprehensive albums, I would say, released during the Tony Martin era, and so I enjoy it a lot. You get some really underrated riffs on here by Tony Iommi, and like I said, this lineup was, you know, really, I would say not celebrated, but definitely worthy of some recognition, so I dig it quite a bit. Again, not the best Black Sabbath record out there, but overlooked, absolutely. Let's switch gears here and talk about Marilyn Manson and We Are Chaos, released in 2020. And this is an album that is very interesting to me, you know, especially if you look at the timeline of Marilyn Manson's career and just really how incredibly seamlessly his career and Alice Cooper's career line up. You know, this album, kind of like DaDa, is a hidden gem in his catalog, released at Manson's rock bottom, and he did not sound great here, you know, slurred vocals, stuff like that. Manson had been on a downward trajectory for a while, and of course stuff in his personal life would come up over the next couple of years, but Manson here was, you know, really at a rock bottom period, and still he pulled out this very underrated album with tracks like Red, Black, and Blue, We Are Chaos, which should have been a much bigger hit in my opinion. Don't Chase the Dead, Paint You With My Love, Halfway and One Step Forward, Keep My Head Together, and Broken Needle. Fantastic closer there. Wish he would do that live. I know we probably never will, but still, you know, you look at this album, you compare it to a record like DaDa from Alice's blackout period, and there's a lot of parallels there and a lot of similarities. But the good thing is they both came out of it, right? Manson's doing some great work now, really revitalizing his career with One Assassination Under God and his current touring. And Alice came out, of course, with Constrictor and Raise Your Fist and Yell and made his big comeback with Trash. And so, you know, all's well that ends well, I guess, but still really cool to kind of see how their careers kind of aligned in that respect, how they kind of hit their own rock bottom and made some really underrated underrated records, during that period. But for me, We Are Chaos has some great stuff on here that, due to probably never being played live, will be, probably swept into the wayside of Manson's catalog, but still should be celebrated a little bit more than it is. Next up, Pink Floyd and The Final Cut. Now, I know not a lot of Floyd fans love this record. This is, of course, Roger Waters being super controlling. It's like Roger was bitten by a radioactive Roger. And it's kind of like a Roger Waters solo record featuring the members of Pink Floyd, right? Roger definitely very self-indulgent on this record as the follow-up to The Wall, and you can tell this was not a full band effort, but nonetheless, there's some great Roger tracks on here, like, Your Possible Pasts, The Gunner's Dream, the Fletcher Memorial Home is great, The Final Cut, Two Suns in the Sunset, so I really enjoy it. This is a guilty pleasure Pink Floyd album for me. It's one that I recognize musically is not as good as the classic stuff in the Big Five, and yet still, it creeps its way into, some of my favorite Pink Floyd records now and then, and it's one of those albums that I enjoy listening to every time I do, and so it's one of those albums here that, definitely was doomed to fail, just from a sense of the band were falling apart. They did not tour this, and Roger was ousted soon after. He had become a control freak here, and you can definitely hear that on the record, but still, some fantastic, vulnerable lyrics by Roger Waters here. I'd say some most underrated and best work of his career. Time for some David Bowie from the Berlin Trilogy. We have Lodger, the final of the Berlin Trilogy, and an album that kind of exists in the shadows of Heroes and Low. It's not as experimental as Low, it's not as iconic as Heroes, and yet there are still some great deep cuts on here that get ignored. Fantastic Voyage, Move On, DJ, Look Back in Anger, Boys Keep Swinging, Repetition is great, Red Money. So lots of great tracks on here. This is an album that, for me personally, I really enjoy more the more I hear it, and the more I go back to the deep cuts on this record, so it's a record that's grown on me a lot. Again, probably the weakest of the Berlin Trilogy, but still some really underrated stuff, in my opinion, from Bowie here, who was always trying different things, always doing something different, and that's one of my favorite things about his catalog, is that no two albums are alike. And with Lodger here, he's still in that experimental, Berlin Trilogy era here, but we're starting to see him come out of it here and do something a bit different. And, it's way different from what he would do on Scary Monsters as well. So Bowie constantly changing and evolving, and this is just a really cool album kind of that shows, the midway point between coming out of that experimental Berlin era and into, a more commercial-friendly, recognizable Bowie sound that he would pursue in the 80s. And so I think it's interesting here, but some great lyrics, in my opinion, from Bowie, some really awesome vocal performances as well. I dig it quite a bit. Last album I'm going to talk about here today, we have Bananas by Deep Purple from 2003. This is my favorite Deep Purple record of the 21st century. I really enjoy it. It's the first with Don Airey on keyboards after John Lord's retirement, and so of course you have massive shoes to fill there, but Don Airey does a fantastic job on this record, which is really a melting pot of a lot of different styles and sounds. It's jazzy, it's bluesy, it's got a great hard rock feel to it as well. You got those aged vocals by Ian Gillan, but they still work. I love tracks on here like House of Pain, Sun Goes Down is so catchy, that's a real earworm. Haunted, Razzle Dazzle, Silver Tongue, Picture of Innocence, I Got Your Number, Bananas, right? Contact Lost. A lot of fun tracks on here. It's a fun listen, in my opinion. Is it to the level of the classic stuff they did in the 70s? Absolutely not. Is it at the level of some of the stuff they did in the 90s? Maybe not, depends on the record, but I still really enjoy this album for what it is. Maybe another guilty pleasure album, if you will, but definitely one that I was looking for a long time. Could not find it for quite a while, but was really happy to add it to my collection when I did. And one of those albums I go back to, time and again, and, just love to go back to those deep cuts on here. So I really enjoy that, and I think, Don Airey, first impression on this record, does a fantastic job as well, kind of showing that the band still had a lot more to offer even after John Lord had retired. So that wraps up this video here of 10 overlooked albums by some of my favorite rock and metal bands. This is not some comprehensive list of my top 10 favorite bands, because quite frankly that changes all the time, but just some bands that I've been listening to in heavy rotation lately and their most underrated or overlooked efforts in this studio. So you guys see my picks right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below what are some of the most underrated or overlooked albums from your favorite bands. I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.